And welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on Chicago Access Network Television. I'm Andy Thayer, and with me tonight is Kevin Gosztola of Fire Dog Lake. And Kevin is going to be discussing the so-called NATO3 trial that's ongoing down at 26th and Cal. And for those in our audience who are not familiar with the case, this is a case that was developed by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in the run-up to the May 2012 NATO conference here in Chicago. People may remember that there was all sorts of hysteria in the press about terrorism and anarchists and all sorts of scary headlines and journalists asking breathless questions of protest organizers about, is the black bloc coming, are anarchists coming, and so forth. And what turned out was, frankly, a farce, that you had the arrests of 5 young activists, 3 of them from Florida, who are currently on trial at 26 and Cal. And as you saw the headline of today's show, it really is a farce. It's a show trial that the Cook County State's Attorney's Office is going on. Kevin is with Fire Dog Lake. He has been covering the trial from the start. He was here during the NATO conference as well, covering the protests. Kevin, as someone who's been to the trial every single day, who experienced the protests and so forth, what is going on at 26 and Cal? What should people in our audience know about what's going down there?
Well, it is truly a spectacle. In fact, they call the public that attends every day spectators. So that shows you what sort of tone they're setting already. And when you sit there, you have these 2 undercover officers now that have been brought in. We know their names. They're Officer Nadia Chico and then Officer Mehmet Egan, who was known as Mo. And they both somehow, I think from the widespread surveillance operation that was being conducted in the months before the NATO meeting, they were sent in to go after these 3 young men.
And these are 3 activists who came up from Florida. And one of the striking things about the testimony that we've heard so far is that you had these undercover Chicago police officers who were plying, for example, a young man, 20 years old, underage, with alcohol, getting to say all sorts of silly things on tape. The man is an alcoholic, and he's underage, and I think you don't want to put a microphone in front of a drunken Cubs or a White Sox fan, let alone a 20-year-old with an alcohol problem, and then treat it as serious evidence of a plot to commit a crime. And that's the caliber of the investigation that we've got.
It seems like also this person, Brian Jacob Church, who they think is like the ringleader of this plot, it sounds like he had substance abuse issues too.
Right.
His one of his cohorts said he was hitting the cough syrup too much.
And you had right on tape there. This is undercover police tape. The undercover officers giving the defendants beer and so forth, and basically getting them to say a lot of silly things. But at the same time, you had the officers themselves making comments trying to spur on the alleged terror activities when the three activists didn't seem to be doing much to get things done. Tell us a little bit about that.
All right, so you have Mo saying things like, I'll make some, and he's talking about the Molotov cocktails, the so-called Molotov cocktails, which are really 4 beer bottles, and we don't know how much gasoline was in these bottles because the police actually dumped the contents of the bottles into the toilet in the apartment where the men were staying.
They destroyed evidence, in other words.
Yeah, but also the evidence was later marked a biohazard, so you're putting that in the sewage system. I don't know how people feel about that in the city here of Chicago, but also these men were told by Nadia things like...
Nadia being one of the undercover officers.
Right. We're told things like, well, I'll go down with you to Obama's headquarters if you want. I'd be happy to go for the ride. Mo said things like, I've got $2. We could go to the gas station. When Brent Betterly, one of the NATO3, said something to the effect of the proper way to make Molotovs is with gasoline. So these men were always focusing people.
Mm-hmm. This is the undercover officers were basically directing them, coaching them in how to produce these implements of the alleged plot against the Obama campaign headquarters was going to be carried out with a slingshot, I believe.
Something like that, and they were very terrified. I guess one of the people. Church was going to shoot a bow and arrow at Rahm Emanuel's house. Mm-hmm. I don't know how that would be.
With a note on it.
With a note on it.
Yes.
Because he doesn't like public officials, and so that makes him a terrorist, because he doesn't like public officials.
Mm-hmm. Well, we do have a caller on the air, and this is a call-in show. We invite you to call the number at the bottom of your screen here. Caller, you're on CAN TV. What's your question or comment?
My concern is how we allowing police to gather, keep, and store information, and have these different types of files on citizens. And I thought that issue was dealt with a long time ago, and how this information they gather, especially when they're dealing in terms of evidence, how this evidence is not really being scrutinized, how it's not really being examined. And then we have the state's attorney almost in the bed with the police, and it's not a separation of how you want to put power departments and all that, like they're all in bed together. And then when you have a situation, when you have a defendant, you really don't have like a one-on-one. You got 3 or 4 people that's against. You got the police department. You have the state's attorney along with the judge, and da-da-da-da-da. I just wonder what happened to certain laws that are supposed to protect us.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, caller. And actually, the very practices that the police department employed in this circumstance were banned under a suit that came out of the late 1960s, the so-called Red Squad. These sort of practices were banned. Unfortunately, during the late Daley administration years, that consent decree was whittled down and basically made to be meaningless. But we've got to remember, this is a Chicago Police Department that not only gave us people like Jon Burge, who systematically tortured African-American suspects into giving false confessions. It's also the Chicago Police Department that spied on the Black Panthers and murdered the Black Panthers. This is a Chicago Police Department that's got a long history of this sort of stuff.
Exactly. What they're talking about, though, is about the National Special Security event, taking advantage of it. That you have to know that the meeting that was held here in May 2012 was designated this National Special Security event. And so when you think about this in terms of the whole country, what they do is they come into the city and they expand all these surveillance apparatuses. We have new cameras on our streets because the meeting came to town, and they were just taking advantage of the event to send these police officers into the activist communities.
And we also have the infamous sit down, shut up ordinances, which basically made it much more difficult and legally perilous for people to organize protests. That was rolled out in advance of the NATO summit, and that's something that you've seen in city after city where these sort of things happen. The authorities use these special national security events to clamp down on protests. We now know that there was a systemic nationwide campaign to shut down Occupy, which our own Rahm Emanuel participated in with the Obama administration, orchestrating these seemingly separate acts in cities around the country. As it turns out now, thanks to a civil rights law office out of D.C., we now know that thanks to the documents that they were able to obtain under subpoena power, that this was a systemic campaign. We do have another caller. Yes, caller, you're on CAN TV. What's your question or comment, please?
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Thayer. This is one of the instances where I have to agree with you. This to me strikes me so much as entrapment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not a good, that's not a good way for the police to be using their resources. Obviously these kids were young, and you at that age you're going to let us steam and you're going to say things. But did they really have the capability of following through? And again, when you entrap somebody, that it's kind of like playing dirty pool. It's not something, as you said, by law that they should have been doing. Those officers could have been working the streets, doing something better. I don't think these kids could get off scot-free. Some type of probation or some, even some kind of hard community service to let them know that you really do have to be mindful of that. I wouldn't let them go scot-free, but I wouldn't put them in jail either. But I'd make them do something where they were doing some physical work, get some work out of them, make them so maybe they'll stop and think twice in the future before they get involved in anything kind of revolutionary. Because you walk a fine line. Neither side, and this can come away squeaky clean if you ask me. Mm-hmm. But again, I would side with you that it's entrapment. And I hope the judges have enough wisdom to see it as such and take into consideration these kids' age and be lenient with them. Because again, I don't think they had anything really bad in their past history and that. But I mean, they need to learn a little lesson, but not too tough. Like I say, would they have even followed through? I mean, everybody has said stuff at that age that they probably regret saying. And if but entrapment is entrapment, and I hope they get off. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, caller, I think you raise by implication a number of important points here. The fact is that the Cook County State's Attorney's Office decided to hit these kids with a sledgehammer of charges rather than saying, well, maybe, conspiracy to commit petty vandalism. I mean, these are crimes of a much lesser import, but instead they made a political case out of it. And I think this is the most important fact of this trial. Why is it that the Cook County State's Attorney's Office under Anita Alvarez, and why was it that Gary McCarthy of the CPD decided to totally go hog wild on these kids that no serious person, and columnist after columnist has noticed, no serious person would consider them a terrorist threat? And I think you have to say there was a political agenda at work here. You're spending millions of dollars on this NATO summit. At the same time, you're shutting off half the city's mental health clinics, and that was just the opening wave of cuts by this mayor. You have to justify this hype about security. And of course, agents have their own career ambitions, but why did Gary McCarthy, why did Anita Alvarez go along with this, Kevin?
I think they're going along with this because they were invested in exactly what you're saying. I think that this is self-perpetuating. I see this as being a case wholly fabricated out of suspicionless surveillance. And it's very topical in this country right now. I'm a national reporter. I've covered National Security Agency whistleblower Edward Snowden. I dropped what I was doing covering that, and I'm now invested in covering this case. But I think it's incredible that I see that all these officers in the police intelligence unit went out to cafes, punk rock shows, public meetings, gatherings.
They couldn't find anything.
They found nothing. And the other thing I'd add for the caller is that these men these young men have been in jail for almost a year and a half. Right. So when we're talking about what sort of lesson they might be taught, I just would make sure that people consider the context of the punishment already, that in fact their lives have been disrupted.
Much of it in solitary confinement and jail abuse that people on the NATO 3 Defense Committee can tell you much more about it. I know that we've got probably callers waiting to get on the air, but we do need to do a few announcements here midway in our show here. First of all, I'd like people to get involved in the Gay Liberation Network. We are an LGBT rights organization, though we do see it as important to have solidarity with all justice causes. Please check us out at our website there, gayliberation.net. And we have our meeting the first Wednesday of each month. Our next one's going to be next Wednesday at the Burger Park Cultural Center, 7 p.m., first Wednesday of each month. And also, we're going to have a protest that we'll be participating in with a lot of other organizations tomorrow against the threat of a new war on Iran. Senator Kirk, our own Senator Kirk, is one of two lead co-sponsors of a very nasty bill, Senate Bill 1881, which would not only impose sanctions, new sanctions, in addition to ones already there, on Iran and thus scupper the peace negotiations going on, but even worse, it would automatically sign off on the United States supporting Israel in an attack on Iran if Israel decided to do so. In other words, the preemptive war that we saw against Iraq is ridiculous as that was. This one goes at one worse. And then finally, if you want to follow Kevin's dispatches from the courtroom and so forth, go to dissenter.firedog.org, and you can see his information there. Lots of articles, not just about the NATO 3 trial, but also important topics such as his on-the-scenes coverage of the Chelsea Manning trial and many others, Edward Snowden, you name it. Kevin is also going to be speaking at an event tomorrow up in Evanston at the Lake Street Church of Evanston at 1 p.m. And so if you want to discuss with him more the NATO 3 and others, please check that out. So we've got a situation where this trial is, I gather the prosecution is going to be resting its case sometime next week. You've got journalists, not just you, but quote-unquote mainstream journalists who basically see this case as a sick joke. And you also have the U.S. Attorney's Office that wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Why is that so?
We're going to learn. We're going to learn when the defense gets to put on its case exactly why the Secret Service, the Secret Service said they couldn't substantiate the threat to Obama's headquarters. That's pretty significant. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to find out exactly why they didn't want to touch this.
Mm-hmm. Well, we also we got another caller here, and we'll pick up more of this conversation. Caller, you're on Candy.
One of the things that we used to have years ago as a as a release valve. Mm-hmm. Let the police do something wrong, or let the judicials do something wrong, like a judge or a prosecutor. We used to be able to sue, but now there's so many different roadblocks, and you got to go through so many procedures in order to sue a city or the police department. I'll give you an example right now. Chicago has somewhere in the neighborhood at least $200 million in pending lawsuit. And even though the police could be wrong left or right, as a matter of fact, they have been on videotape, hurting somebody. And there's so many different laws to stop you from suing them. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's right, and that's one of the biggest problems with, for example, the problems faced by the Burge victims is that you have these prosecutors who basically make their careers off of these young black men, and they are all black men, which says something about the state of race in this city. And nothing happens to these prosecutors. In fact, they typically get promoted. The same thing with the CPD. I mean, Jon Burge didn't start out as a commander, but he was promoted up through the ranks, as so many of these really notorious cops are over and over again. And for a previous caller who was saying that we might be able to get some sort of relief, hopefully, from the judge, this judge, Thaddeus Wilson, is no friend of civil liberties. Tell us a little bit about that, if you could, please.
Well, I just know that sitting in the courtroom, what has become clear is the judge is going to go along with a lot of what the prosecution wants to do. Now, I've been kind of impressed with the latitude that the defense has been afforded. You know, they've been able to ask a range of questions at times. He's let the prosecutors actually make stupid moves that dig themselves into a hole.
Well, they haven't been, you mentioned in your articles, they haven't been objecting to some of the things.
No, they claim that it's bad to object because the jury will get the wrong impression. Like they've never seen a trial before. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't know. It's really condescending towards the people in the jury. But, they were objecting to the fact that there has been this focus on police conduct, which is, it really speaks volumes, I think, about the trial, because they actually said to the judge, we would like them to not mention the First Amendment at all in this trial. It shows you where their interests lie. You know, somebody saw the defense cross-examination of Nadia, the undercover officer, and panicked in the police department and said, you've got to find a way to clamp down on this. They're getting police reports. They're getting the surveillance information that we collected without suspicion, violating people's rights. They're getting that into the court record, and you need to find a way to stop that. And they said, we want to instruct the jury to disregard all of this information so that the defense wouldn't bring it up.
Even though the police investigation was labeled, in their own terminology, a First Amendment investigation.
Yeah.
They were snooping around places like the Heartland Cafe, punk rock shows, and so forth, all around the city, desperately trying to find any so-called evidence of terrorism.
Yeah.
Now, what do you think, what are the implications of this case, not just for this city, but nationally? I mean, this is not just a case of 3 young men's lives being ruined, holed up at 26th and Cal for a year and a half, but to me, it says something much more.
To me, it's about the perverse culture within law enforcement. They have this narrative about these young men. Mm-hmm. They conceived these ideas about who they were before they even had the evidence to go after them. And then they went about finding that evidence. And when they weren't getting what they wanted, they got the undercover cops to get them to say some things to get them closer to that end point, because they had a timeline. The meeting's happening on May 19th and 20th. They got to arrest these guys before the meeting. And when they got the arrests and they got them raided, now the prosecutors have to go about finding evidence. And they're basically creating a case out of thin air.
In fact, many of the tape recordings show the undercover officers saying, "Oh, this meeting's coming up. We got to start constructing these devices and so forth." They were irritated at the lackadaisicalness of the defendants in terms of pursuing this crime that they were ostensibly trying to prevent.
We're so desperate that they've gone to Facebook messages from mid-April. This is before they're even left Florida to come here. And they're going to use their words against them to convince the jury that they're bad people, but they don't have any evidence of crimes. They don't have any evidence of intent to commit crimes, and they just have them on tape talking.
Yeah. So anyway, you can again follow this trial in person. What's the story on that? Court starts 10 a.m. each day. Is that correct?
We're starting 10 a.m. each day. We're up again on Monday, and if you come out, you can see it. It's quite amusing at times, unfortunately.
26th and Cal, and it's on the 6th floor. Is that correct?
Fifth floor.
Fifth floor, sorry. Yes, and it is quite a spectacle. It's your tax dollars at work, basically entrapping these young men, and it's a real tragedy, not just for them, but for civil liberties in general here in Chicago. And so we're going to, unfortunately, have to wrap things up here. Thank you very much, Kevin Gosztola from Fire Dog Lake. I'm Andy Thayer, and we're going to close our show with a few quick announcements. First of all, you can get in touch and watch Kevin's coverage of not just the NATO3 trial, but others by going to dissenter.firedoglake.org and find out all of Kevin's excellent journalism there. And also, he's going to be speaking tomorrow night at the Lake Street Church of Evanston. I should say tomorrow afternoon at 1 p.m. Check him out up in Evanston if you have the chance. And again, tomorrow, unfortunately, at right about the same time, 1:30 p.m. tomorrow on State and Lake Street, there's going to be a protest to prevent a new war against Iran and our own Senator Kirk's involvement in trying to get that going, unfortunately. You can check out the Gay Liberation Network, get involved in our organization. We meet the first Wednesday of each month at 7 p.m. at the Burger Park Cultural Center. And our next show on CAN TV is, we're typically on the second Friday of each month. Today is an extra show that we got. And finally, we'd like to thank all those who made tonight's show possible.